So thanks everyone for joining. I'm Kelly from Output Sports, and welcome to our VBT Roundtable with Chris and Steve. So in this roundtable session, Chris and Steve will discuss the practical applications of VBT, acute decision making. They'll also discuss understanding the likes of fatigue management and then appropriate programming modifications. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat, and I'll drop a message in first so you guys get a notification and see where it's to go. And I'll hand it over to the ones you actually came to listen to. So Chris and Steve, you guys can take it away.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, it's fantastic to have everybody join. That's the first and foremost, the most important thing. We've actually got an audience to speak to and to interact with, which is super cool. And I'm obviously really excited to have Stephen on, because he is a VBT expert, done his PhD in the subject area. We want to dive deep into a couple of main topic areas, but Stephen, please do give us a whistle-stop introduction to your VBT journey and everything else about you as a coach.
Of course. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much to Output and to Chris and Kelly for inviting me tonight. Yeah, so my history, I work at Sheffield Hallam University, senior lecturer, course leader in the MSc Strength and Conditioning Coaching. As Chris said recently, well, sort of a year ago, passed my PhD in low velocity profiling and its ability to predict 1RM, which we will come on to at some point, I'm sure. I'm sort of an active early career researcher, trying to do a lot more in the world of VBT, and a practicing S&C coach at the same time. So work across a number of different sports and a number of different organizations.
Awesome. Love it. So we've just had literally a whistle stop. Steve and I do go back a fair while. It would be remiss of me not to mention, is it a go day or a slow day? We talked about this probably, 3 or 4 years ago. And then I saw that phrase. I saw that phrase on a published research paper from Stephen. I didn't get cited, so I'm a little bit sour about that, if I'm honest. But all in good humor. Yeah. It's all about, is it a go day or is it a slow day? And we're going to dive into that when it comes to velocity-based training. And hopefully Stephen, with his expertise, is going to give us a little bit of a deep dive into his kind of first 3 go-to plug and play VBT kind of applications. So should we kick off with that, Steve, and then just open it up to the floor to see who wants to interact and ask a few questions?
Yeah, why not? Kelly, will you skip along to the second one, please? Next one, please. Yeah, that one. So I've actually this is from one of my PhD papers, which was published a few years ago. So I've kind of amended it a little bit now. And I always, whenever I talk about VBT, I always kind of break it down into 6 main categories. So within that, you've got testing, you've got monitoring, you've got programming and prescription, you've got auto reg, you've got volume control or fatigue management, and you've got feedback. And within those areas, you can kind of fit a number of VBT applications within it. And I think, us researchers, if I put my research hat on, we can make things very, very complex, and they absolutely do not need to be complex. And there are three things that I think we can really utilize from VBT really, really easily, plug and play type approaches that doesn't require a whole lot of previous baseline testing, profiling, or any kind of work. And these 3 things for me are feedback. So utilizing VBT to kind of drive intent, drive healthy competition and stuff like that, just through simple feedback of numbers and information. Simple monitoring, which I'll kind of dive into it in a little bit in terms of some of the strategies that you could utilize as a real simple way of monitoring someone's adaptations and someone's progression. And then kind of the volume control or implementing something like velocity loss, which I think is another real key aspect of VBT that is used, certainly heavily researched, but I think there's clear ways in which we can utilize it, and we can kind of, again, go through that tonight as well in this session.
Beautiful.
All right, so yeah, starting straight in, feedback I think is an important one. So there's lots of different ways we can utilize feedback. And there's lots of kind of considerations that we need to think about when we do utilize feedback. But ultimately, the idea of providing feedback is giving the athlete or group of athletes some form of information that's going to drive and motivate and create some intent. So simply by implementing a piece of technology, let's say output for argument's sake tonight, and utilizing their VBT application, you can simply get someone set up, get someone doing an exercise, and already start to create a greater mechanical output just by providing them with some feedback. So just by saying to them either, you know, from a very simplistic method, giving them encouragement, so providing them with, you know, move faster, keep pushing, all that kind of, you know, the kind of jargon that you might hear within an S&C suite, but more validly and probably more effectively providing them with specific feedback from the velocities that they're hitting. So giving them the numbers and making sure that we provide that feedback after every single rep. So there's a little bit of research out there on feedback. Not much, not enough, I think. Again, as researchers, we seem to fall down or go down the similar path of profiling. And often a lot of that profiling is done in bench press and in Smith machines, which you could argue doesn't have the largest of crossovers across different training spaces. But there is a little bit in feedback, and kind of the research suggests that immediate feedback is definitely the best way. So you could provide feedback after a set, you could provide feedback after a session, but ultimately the idea of feedback is to drive intent. By driving intent, we hopefully drive a bigger mechanical output, which means we move the bar faster, and by virtue we get greater neuromuscular adaptations. And so that's kind of the first thing to consider. The next thing to consider, I would say, when it comes to feedback is what kind of feedback we provide them. So do we provide our athletes with something that's audible? You know, again, output will provide a ding if it's in the green, or a dong if it's in the red, if depending on what kind of method we're using. Or we might say the velocities as well to our athletes. We might read them out to them, versus having an iPad or an iPhone in front of the athlete and getting them to read the numbers and take that back. And again, the research suggests that audible sound is a more effective way of providing feedback. I couldn't be 100% sure on the physiology, but I'm guessing it's something, because this hasn't been looked into, certainly not within the research I've read. But I'm sort of surmising that by reading a number, looking at something in front of you, there's some kind of cognitive function going on there that's perhaps taking away from the maximal output that's required for lists.
Isn't sound is a faster, you've got a faster reaction to sound than you have to sight, I think, also.
Maybe so, Carl.
Yeah, I think you do. Yeah.
Sounds good to me. We'll go with that. Yeah.
Thanks, Carl.
Yeah. Yeah, I do. Yeah. Because I do like a bit of, I do love my vision training. So I kind of looked into reactions, and it is, okay. Yeah. And I think touch is a bit quicker. Touch is quicker, I think, as well. Yeah, I think sight is slowest. Yeah. Cool.
Well, there we go. So obviously, potentially that is another reason then that we have a quicker reaction to sound. So that's kind of the second consideration. And then the third one is simply the type of feedback that we provide. So if we're going to do it immediately after rep and we're going to do it in an audible fashion, what do we provide? Do we, as I mentioned, do we provide them with that simple encouragement, or do we provide them with feedback on the actual number, the repetition, the velocity that's lifted? And again, the small amount of research that's out there suggests that tangible number is the better option. So instead of saying move faster, we say 1.5, 1.52, 1.53, etc., etc. And combining those three things then can be a really, really strong way of, as I've mentioned, driving intent and motivation, hopefully enhancing performance improvements, educating athletes, and also driving sort of like a competitive environment, but a healthy competitive environment, and actually getting buy-in. So I work a lot in football, and I've seen it firsthand that, you know, in some sports, football one of them, load isn't something that's particularly sought after. You know, chasing heavy loads isn't something that fires those athletes up. But then as soon as you get a piece of technology involved, as soon as you get a bit of a leaderboard going and you ask them to move a load as quickly as possible, well, then you create some competition and then you create some buy-in. And that's ultimately what we want to do as coaches. We want buy-in. If we don't get buy-in, it doesn't matter what tech we use, it doesn't matter what program we write. It's all kind of a little bit pointless. So if we can get buy-in, then we're off to a good start. And I think that's one of the main benefits of feedback. Chris,
Nice.
go on. I'll let you.
That's great. No, I really like the fact that you've kind of used your football example, soccer for those in the United States. I had the exact same issue, and I worked in professional cricket, and I might have shared this story before with those who may or may not have heard me talk on this subject area. But one of the things that really got the cricket players on the hook when it came to, I guess, valuing strength and conditioning a little bit more was the feedback piece, without a shadow of a doubt. And also a bit like what Stephen's just referenced, which is creating, I guess, internal competition within the peer-to-peer training environment, and making sure that rep by rep, boys basically were competing against each other, moving fixed loads and as fast as they could, as long as their form was good, etc., etc. But that piece was really interesting, because without the technology and the integration of the technology, there was definitely not quite the same training environment. Integration of the technology was without a doubt something that was not just an aha moment, but a moment where player buy-in kind of ramped up a level. And then, like you know, Steve's already mentioned, the training intent, the training output then is subsequently increased. So it's a huge piece of the plug and play puzzle, which is integrate the tech. I know we're going to go on to monitoring and other things as well, but from the feedback piece alone, you can get output from the player group. Output from the player group is ultimately training transfer and improved performance. So that's a win. But did you want to jump into the monitoring piece, Steve?
Yeah, I can do. I think so. One of my bugbears with more the research in VBT is that it seems to make things very complex, and I don't know if that's just the way research is. And the more complex we go, the further removed we get from the applied world. And I'm, you know, I am a researcher, and that's probably more of my role than being a coach. But I think the research has to feed into the applied world. So I think there's again 2 or 3 ways we can really utilize VBT in a very simplistic fashion and get some real big outcomes and outputs from it. And simple monitoring is one of those. So one thing that I've utilized really, really successfully in the past is using VBT, or using velocity measures for readiness to train. So through some of the kind of long-standing work I've done with GB diving, we spent a long time measuring jump data, but measuring velocity from that jump data every single session. So we would either do single repeats, as in a set of 5, but a pause in between each rep, or we might do rebound jumps. We would take mean or peak velocity, and we would simply track it across every single session. And by doing so, not only did it act as a little bit of a primer, because again, you can get that competition going, you can get that feedback involved, and you can get that little bit of drive and intent at the very start of the session, which is really, really important. But you can also use it as a real simple way of tracking progression, for one. So is our program working? But more importantly, we can track fatigue. So we can look at how ready someone is to actually undertake that session.
Is that related to the RSI? So you basically said do the RSI test.
No. So I would simply just measure mean or peak velocity during a jump. Not interested about ground contact, not interested about jump height, just simply interested in velocity. Okay. And the main reason I'm interested in velocity is because velocity has a direct neuromuscular function. So if we break down kind of movement, if we break down force production, if we break down kind of the biomechanics of what we ask our athletes to do, ultimately it's always underpinned by force and velocity. If we break down any of the kind of the conventional physical equations, it always comes back down to force and velocity.
So you say you're trying to narrow it, so you're just testing force and velocity. You're not having any extraneous variables that's going to affect it. Is that what you're saying?
In a sense, yeah. I mean, I'm not even measuring force because I've not got the capabilities of doing that, or not simply like I would do with a VBT device. But all I'm saying is measuring something like velocity, which has that clear relationship with what's happening neuromuscularly in our systems, versus, let's say, another common method of measuring jump height. I would always go down the velocity route because of that relationship to that neuromuscular function.
Okay.
Jump height is an okay method.
Yeah.
Jump height itself is dictated by strategy, dictated by a number of other variables that maybe are a little bit more variable and a little bit more or less reliable. Whereas we know where we stand with velocity. And for me, one of the really good ways it worked was not to say, oh, well, your velocity had dropped by 10%, so we change your program by X amount, or we do X, Y, Z to your program. It was actually just to have a conversation, to spark a conversation. So they come in, normally they're jumping at, let's say, 2.5, 3 meters per second, something like that. Suddenly it drops from 3 to 2.6, 2.7. I'm not going to start stripping stuff out until I've had a conversation with that person. And I say, how did you sleep last night? What's your load been like this week? How did you eat? How are you feeling a bit ill? All those kind of questions that we potentially would ask anyway as a coach, but certainly when you're in a room, I think of 15, 20 athletes, having those in-depth and important conversations with everybody would maybe take up half your session. But if you can simply get some feedback data and make that autonomous to the athletes and say, right, how far are you down from where you were last session or last week or your average or whatever, right, let's have that conversation. And then we can start making those changes if we feel it's important and necessary. Chris, anything to come back on?
No, perfect. I mean, I always used a loaded jump, even though it was a light implement, it's a 20 kilo barbell. Always used that as a kind of precursor to my training. And like you've suggested as well, it's definitely kind of a primer for what's coming as well. When you've got that low load as a benchmark for the start of the session, then you can get going. And like you say, it's either a conversation with the athlete, and then obviously we will lead this into, is it a go day or a slow day? But that's coming slightly later. But that is initially the first thing you're going to do is with that feedback, drive that intent, move this unloaded barbell as fast as you can with a jump squat, repeated jumps, like you say, rep by rep with a stop in between. Where were you last week? Where were you the week before? What's your rolling average? You know, like you say, in collision sport that I historically worked in, you're looking at modifications in gym sessions anyway, but ultimately you're not going to strip a ton out, because otherwise players would end up doing no training because they're quite wise old foxes. But the reality is, it's that initial conversation point. I love the fact that my dog is barking like a complete lunatic behind me, so apologies for
that. So would you say, so you say the test, you say a body weight jump, velocity jump, or a loaded? It has to be a loaded jump.
It can be either. I've used unloaded. I've used, like Chris said, I've used loaded. I think
loaded percentage, is it? Yeah.
Say again, sorry.
Is it a percentage?
I mean, if you're going to do it at the start of the session, I wouldn't be going past a 20k bar anyway, unless you've got some really strong guys in there and you, or guys and girls in there, and you know what they can tolerate. I suppose it is a part of that is knowing your athletes and where they're at and their strength levels. But I think it has to be standardized. So if you're going to use that data, it has to be the same every session. There's obviously no point in changing the load. And I think in reality, for ease and quickness, if you're having to mess around loading and unloading bars, it slows things down. So I think body weight or a barbell.
Workflow for me, it's either a dowel, which is obviously unloaded, it weighs next to nothing, or it's a unloaded barbell at 20 kgs for men and 15 for girls.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I'll take that. Yeah.
The other thing, I think the other thing to note on monitoring is, again, there's many environments where 1RM testing, 3RM testing, 5RM testing are just not feasible. They're not sought after, they're not feasible. There isn't the time to do them. There isn't the training history to do them. There's lots of reasons not to do that maximal strength testing. And this isn't me slating it. I think it definitely has a place and it's important. And if we have athletes that can do it, then we should do it. But I think in the instances where we can't, there's a real simple testing method that's never been researched, never even really been spoken about, but is so simple. Maybe it's too simple. That's why it's not been spoken about. Who knows? But it's simply picking a submaximal load. So let's say, and it could relate to a percentage of 1RM if we have an idea of what that is, or maybe it's just an arbitrary load. And perhaps something like 60, 80, 100K, depending on that person, depending on that person's strength level. And performing whatever your key exercise is, whether that's a jump, whether that's a squat, whether that's a deadlift, whether that's a bench press, whatever it is, picking a load, sticking to that load, and measuring the velocity at intermittent points throughout an intervention, even during training or whatever, and mapping progress. Because ultimately, again, strength and adaptations often boils down to Newton's second law, which is force equals mass times acceleration. Well, if we kind of unpick that relationship, the mass is whatever's on the bar. That's going to stay fixed. We're never going to change that. Okay. If then we increase the velocity, which is by virtue the acceleration of the bar, well, then we've increased the A part of that equation. And if the A part goes up, then the F part needs to go up, which is force. Force underpins strength. Hey presto, we understand whether someone's got stronger by simply moving the same load at faster speeds and faster velocities. Obviously, we can do the flip side of that, and we can pick a velocity and we can look at the load that's performed at that velocity. If that load continues to increase, again, we've got stronger. But it just boils down to a very simple equation that underpins, again, is the heart of resistance training, of kind of biomechanics and biomechanics of training, and is something that I don't really know goes on very often. Chris, you might be able to tell me otherwise. You've got a lot more experience within the field than I do, but it seems like a simple option that doesn't get used a lot.
It's brilliant. I mean, I love the fact that you're bringing that kind of research and insights perspective to this, as well as that applied coaching perspective. And I'll tell you from my experiences in the environments that I've worked in, I historically never did a 3 or a 5 RM test. Like you say, there's a certain amount of time required for people who want to do well at a test. So they have a deload day or a deload week or whatever they might do to kind of get ready for a testing week or a testing day. Whereas I think one of the real benefits of velocity-based training and the integration of it in practice is you can benchmark somebody's strength levels within their strength training program at any given time, like you've suggested, using a fixed load. So for my examples and my experiences, I would always use a fixed load with certain players. And I guess when you get to know people in certain environments, you know where their strength levels sit predominantly anyway, through your record keeping and your understanding of their physiology and what have you. But I'd always do exactly what you've suggested there, Steve, which is fixed loads, moved faster today than you did yesterday, you've ultimately got stronger. And you never, ever then have to really have a specific testing day set aside for benchmarking. You can benchmark at any time with a fixed load. Did you move 150 kilos on the hex bar this week faster than last week or slower than last week? If it's faster than last week by 0.05 meters per second, which is essentially that kind of, I guess, meaningful change kind of number that we look at. Have they moved the bar quicker than last week? Yes. Okay, well, you're stronger than last week. Is the programming effective? Are you neurally ready and fresher than last week? Probably yes. All those factors come into sort of making good decisions about not only training now, but obviously the auto regulation of that programming as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I've done it, but I know what you mean. There's a lot of people who spend a lot of time testing when actually velocity-based training integrated into your programming is testing all of the time or benchmarking all of the time.
Well, that's it, isn't it? That's for me being a good coach is, you know, there's kind of a bit of a buzzword going around sports science at the minute called of invisible profiling. It's it's more kind of centered on, you know, team sports and what can we get from GPS, but actually, if you think about what invisible profiling means, it means collecting data without them knowing that you're collecting data. So there's no reason why that can't be done within the gym setting during a program using VBT. And actually, I know we're going to maybe get onto profiling a little bit, but there's no reason why we can't create a profile over a long period of time just from training data, because we know that, again, if we're a good coach, we're going to cycle through different loads. We're going to cycle through different phases of training. We're going to get essentially a good chunk of that profile just from training data. And that then becomes a lot more autonomous and a lot more iterative in terms of, right, well, it's going to constantly be updated. We don't have to put in these fixed testing sessions. We can just do it as we go and look at the data and collect the data. And as long as we're happy that data is reliable, then happy days.
Absolutely. I mean, that's where my programming philosophy evolved anyway. When I had a low load, high velocity kind of speed strength element, I had a strength speed element, and I had a max strength element. So almost to Dan Baker's kind of philosophy around profiling at the sort of speed end of the curve and the force end of the curve. I've got something that's relatively light that I've moved relatively quickly. I've moved moderately heavy, moderately fast, and I've moved something heavy relatively slowly at the force end of the curve. I've almost got, I know it's only 3 data points, but with very strong athletes that work predominantly in rugby in my exposure, you've got a 1.5 meter per second lift, you've got a 1 meter per second lift, you've got a 0.5 meter per second lift. I know that's a very simplistic way of putting it, but you've got basically a speed strength, a strength speed, and a max strength number from a loading perspective and a velocity perspective. You can almost plot that. You can plot that profile without the player even knowing that you've done that data capture and you've utilized that data effectively for the following kind of, you know, fatigue management or load prescription for the future.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
So then it can start to influence your program design and also the way your daily workflow goes. So going back to the sort of readiness with an unloaded barbell, that could be the first data point that you collect when it comes to that load velocity profile at high velocity, especially for those people who have maybe only got a predicted, excuse the word predicted 1 RM of a 200 squat. 20 kilos is 20% of 1 RM. You can then start your data collection there and work through a session with maybe 50% and 70%. You've got, you know, 3 data points of maybe a 5 data point plot already gathered without even asking the athlete to do anything extra within their session.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. Velocity loss, is that next?
It is. Yeah. Is it a go day? We've got to, I mean, we've been talking for 30 minutes and we haven't even mentioned, is it a go day or a slow day? So
go on, then.
Yes, the really good thing, we've led nicely into that, because from a feedback perspective, from a monitoring perspective, we're now building a picture within our training. So let's just go back to sort of in snapshot and acute training setting. We've done our monitoring, our readiness to train. We've obviously given our athletes a level of feedback when it comes to driving intent and motivation, when it comes to that initial data capture. We've then had that conversation around that readiness to train. So I guess velocity loss and load prescription leads nicely into the sort of main body and the meat and potatoes of our training session. So I guess, yeah, give us your thoughts on that initial exposure to particularly maximum strength and where you see velocity loss as a really important metric when it comes to sort of, I guess, fatigue management and load prescription going forward, not just in this session, but maybe for a sort of more chronic or longitudinal approach to training.
Yeah. So I think one of the things I always like to stress within this, when I ever talk about velocity loss, is the fact that, you know, we've all gone through, we all probably all still do it. We follow the training principles, or we try to follow the training principles of individualizing training, making it specific, all those kind of things. But I think we do a really good job at individualizing intensity, but we do a really poor job at individualizing volume. Because how often have we written a program that's the classic 5x5 at 85%, or 6x3 at 90%, or 8x4 at whatever, we individualize the intensity, but then we use these blanket volume prescriptions of 5x5, 6x3, 4x8, whatever it might be. And that for me moves away from those key training principles. And again, just touching on the research that's out there at the moment, there's a couple of pieces of research that combine different types of athletes performing sets to failure at the same relative load. And at 70% 1RM, for example, we had a weightlifting group, and it's weightlifting because it's not 100% clear on their background, but they have weightlifting experience versus what they deemed an endurance running group. And at 70% 1RM, the weightlifting group were lifting 17, 18 reps. The endurance group were lifting 39 to 40 reps. Now that's over 100% extra number of reps performed, and therefore 100% extra work done. And there, for me, gives a real strong example of blanket set by rep prescriptions really are so far removed from individualizing training, and we need something else to help rein that in and bring that together. And that's where velocity loss, I think, really comes into its own and becomes a really strong tool as an S&C coach. So going back to what you mentioned, Chris, around its importance for strength development, the whole premise of velocity loss is we can provide a fixed reduction in velocity as a means to terminating a set. So instead of it being a number of repetitions performed in a set, we can say to our athletes, when your velocity drops by X amount, so if we're going to look at maximal strength, we're going to look at something around 20 to 25%. When that drops by that amount, again, going back to the feedback, you'll hear the ding, ding, dings whilst it's above 20%. And as soon as you hear it go below 20%, you'll get the big, awful dong. And then that's your cue to stop lifting that set. And, you can then break that down. If you want to say, for example, in this session, I want you to perform 5 reps of 5 sets of 20% velocity loss. The number of reps is irrelevant. You might hit 8 reps in the first set. You might hit 2 reps in the last set. It all depends on a number of different variables. Or you might say, well, actually, I know the amount of work I want to be done within this session is 25 reps, but I'm not going to set the number of sets. So I'm going to say, right, first set, you do as many reps until you hit 20% velocity loss. Then the next set, until you get to 25 reps. 2 different ways of doing it. No real right or wrong way. No one is better than the other. I think if I had to hang my hat, I would go for the number of sets versus the number of total reps in the session. But that's just personal preference, no real scientific basis behind it. But what that does then is it takes into account individual differences based around neuromuscular capability, based around strength, based around training history, but as importantly, based around fatigue and readiness to train again. So what we're doing there is we're trying to auto-regulate, I suppose is probably the right word. We're trying to auto-regulate, but we're auto-regulating volume, and we're doing it in a real, again, to keep using that phrase, plug and play, quick and easy way of doing it without having to do any prior testing or profiling or anything like that. And I think therein lies a real strong approach. And then we can periodize that as well if we really want to, because we have a continuum there of 5%, probably realistically down to about 40%. I think when we get to 40%, we're getting pretty close to failure. And a lot of the more recent research suggests these days that actually we don't want to go too close to failure. And if we do, we certainly don't want to do it very often. So we can then periodize that, and we can look at, 40% is obviously going to be a hell of a lot more work, which means we're going to have a hell of a lot more metabolic and sort of morphological, so muscular based adaptations. But with that comes muscular breakdown, metabolic stress, and a lot of or a larger time, sort of cost time to recovery that we need. Flip side of that, we might go for 5-10%, where we're going to be doing small amount of work, so small number of repetitions, And that then lends itself to very, very short times period, sort of time to recovery. And that's therefore going to go very close to where we might be getting close to competition. And we can periodize that. We can follow our typical periodized models. We can do it undulating. If we're in a team sport, we can do it blocked. We can do it linearly. But we're individualizing it instead of using these blanket general volume prescriptions, which seems to be very, very, well, maybe it's easy. Maybe that's why. Or maybe people don't have access to the technology. Who knows? But I think we can do better in that space. I think we do really well in the intensity space. I think we can do better in the volume space. And I think this is a simple way of doing it.
Absolutely. That you've articulated that really, really well, Stephen. In terms of just, I mean, from my own personal experience in application, having a framework of, and I've said this before online and various podcasts and what have you, I literally have such a simple framework of, and I know this integrates the volume, total volume as well, but it's three to 5 sets, 3 to 5 reps. I know that sounds really, really simplistic, but there's going to be some players who are feeling good, who do their 25 reps to take your 5x5 analogy. But there's also going to be some who are maybe more fatigued through their other training exposure or competition load, for example, who only do who do 3 sets of 3 and anywhere in between. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So on any given day, someone might do 9 reps and someone might do 25 reps. That's the individualization of strength stimulus, without driving too much fatigue, because we have allowed for that velocity loss. That's a good barometer of adequate stimulus without additional fatigue being piled upon them. I know you understand that concept. Those in the audience listening in, do you understand that concept? Where we're trying to manage and deliver the right stimulus on the right day in the right amount, so that we don't continue to layer fatigue onto an athlete, especially if they train multiple times a day. They're sports players with a heavy competition schedule, those kind of things. We want the right amount at the right time in the right day. And that's where Stephen's planning and periodization comes in as well, where the nearer we are to competition, the narrower our bandwidth of velocity loss, almost, so that we can speed up our recovery cycle. And maybe further away from competition, we can allow for a little bit more velocity loss.
Yeah.
But both times we're driving the quality of adaptation against the volume. Here's a question. Joe, how are you? Here we go. You're still with us. Well, let's just have a little stop for this one. So will you pick a velocity zone to target acceleration zone, for example, and then secondary pick 15 to 20% drop off? So now you are working in a zone for a specific strength quality, but you're managing the fatigue from set to set and overall. So yeah, I mean, Stephen, do you want to take that and I can just jump in after?
Yeah, I think what you've described there, Joe, is kind of your immersive VBT approach. You've looked at VBTing, if we can make it into a verb, VBTing the intensity and the volume at the same time. And yeah, I think that's a perfectly good way of doing it, and a perfectly viable way, because and we'll come on to the auto reg in a probably a couple of minutes, but we're auto regging both parts of the equation, if you will. We're auto regging the volume and the intensity. So absolutely, I think that's a really good way of doing it, and we're controlling. We're not leaving anything down to guesswork there. We're kind of listening to the neuromuscular system and what it's telling us. To quote the title of the evening, is it a go day? Can we push? Can we do the intended the sort of volume and intensities, or is it a slow day? And are we going to have to strip stuff back based off what our fresh baseline testing might tell us that we're capable of doing? So yeah, I think that's a really, really good way of doing it, Joe.
Yeah. And I don't think we need, especially when you're looking at athlete populations, I would say a 20% loss for lower body strength development particularly is a really, really is the kind of good cutoff that I've seen players able to recover from. So I don't know whether, Joe, you're still working in combat sports, but 20% loss for me from a development of maximum strength particularly is a really good cutoff for the right amount of strength stress without it being too much. Does that make sense? Great.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
I think that covers velocity loss, does it? Is there anything else you
No,
would add into that?
It absolutely does. I just think, like you've suggested, Steve, it's really, really an important metric that actually has a massive, massive influence on, like you say, the individualization of a training session. Doesn't have to be that rigid programming structure that's put on paper. You can move with the day-to-day fluctuations in human physiology and manage up or down accordingly. And I think if people have one thing to take away from this kind of presentation, it would be, don't be so rigid in your framework of programming and program design, but have some bandwidth. And if you've got access to the technology, absolutely implement it for your core lifting, so that you can put those parameters in place, so that 20% loss, if it's a set of 3, it's a set of 3. If it's a set of 5, it's a set of 5, and monitor and manage that loading longitudinally with your record keeping as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We got another question. So Joe's asked again, if hypertrophy is the goal, would a 20 to 30% drop off be a good range to choose for that? What are you saying, Chris? I mean, no, I think typically.
I'm going to say more.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, typically, Joe, there's a paper from Jonathan Weekly and his group. I think you'll agree here, Steve. You're looking at developing strength and kind of athletic qualities at 20%. In order to deliver that stimulus for more hypertrophy and development of that, you're looking at about a 40% loss. So like Stephen just alluded to, more metabolic damage, more morphological change when it comes to, it's almost like, as you can imagine, to get from 20% loss to 40% loss is that typical, or that kind of first principle of time under tension. It's going to take you longer to get a 40% loss. So just by that alone, you're going to drive that kind of adaptation type mechanism for hypertrophy as opposed to strength development. So yeah, probably 40% anywhere. It's also, Joe, in this instance, it's about the training tolerance that somebody can cope with, because as you and I both know, there's going to be people who are very uncomfortable with that kind of metabolic cost of doing reps at a 40% velocity loss, because it's going to hurt a little bit more. Whereas there's going to be other players who, yeah, exactly. You've got it, MRV. Exactly right. You've got people who can tolerate higher loads in terms of stress on their body. So 40% might be too much for some, but it's got to be plus. It's got to be over 30 in my experiences, and obviously the literature sort of validates that in the conversation as well.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think as well, one of the things that it just jumped into my head then. One of the things that velocity loss and all VBT really, but velocity loss I've had a positive experience with in terms of educating athletes what they are capable of. So I'm talking maybe the either on the younger age or maybe just a smaller training age, or potentially just not really familiar with lifting heavy or lifting to fatigue, for example. You know, to kind of give you a bit of an anecdote, working with a diver quite a few years ago, we were playing around with velocity loss, and I think we were doing 20% velocity loss. And in my head, I had an idea of the number of reps that I wanted that athlete to perform. So she loaded the bar up to what she felt was the right load for the number of reps that I said I want you to be able to do, but we're going to work off the velocity loss. 25 reps later, bearing in mind that number was around 6. 25 reps later, she was still moving it and still above the 20% drop off. And when eventually she'd stopped, I think we had to cut the set because she would have gone forever. I kind of I questioned it and said, what does that tell you? She said, I could probably lift more. And I said, go on then. Load some more on. She went and got 2.5s, and I said, come on, I think do a hell of a lot more than that. And we loaded it up and we got closer to those 6 reps, and everything looked better. And really it was just for her to understand what she was capable of, as opposed to us dictating. It was a bit of a light bulb moment for her, I think, at the time. And after that, she kind of pushed herself and understood what she was capable of. So I think that's
probably the biggest thing that we've had on our side of things as well. Like the education and understanding what intent truly means has been massive for us over with the athletes that we work with. Like when the first 2 weeks, when you bring this in, the bars and the velocity, they're going all over the place, aren't they? Like one rep will be up at 1.2, the next rep will be 0.6. they're like, what's going on? And then 2-3 weeks down the line, I'm like, okay, this is what it means to train with intent. And that's probably been the biggest benefit from us. It's just them understanding what it means to drive and get those simulations where they need to be found. 100%.
Yeah, it's great point, Mitch. I think education is massive in certainly with those athletes that have a smaller training age, and that's how VBT can be really positive. And it's certainly those lighter loads. I've been there myself. You see them all over the place, and it's just getting a feel for moving things quickly, because ultimately, when do we not want to move things with maximal intent? I don't know a situation where I would want to train my athletes sort of sub-maximally, and I don't mean that but in terms of intensity and load. I mean sub-maximal effort. I don't know if there is an environment or a situation where I'd want to do that, intentionally move slow, tempo type training maybe, but I don't think that's kind of that big of a thing anymore. So I think that's
it's more of a skills thing. You want to move slow, your skill and fate and deception and stuff like that, rather than that's the only time you'd want to go slow.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of maybe referring to lifting weights as opposed to within the sport itself. But yeah, I understand what you're saying, Carl. Yeah.
We've got a question here from Matt. I didn't want to just leave you hanging any longer, Matt. You asked it about 10 minutes ago. Would you typically just use VBT for squat, deadlift, and bench? Is that for velocity loss? Just to answer that, I guess, in the first part, sure. I mean, I've typically used VBT and the velocity loss element, particularly with my main lift of the training session. So historically, for those who know me, they know I'm biased towards either pushing a sled or lifting a hex bar. I typically only use VBT for my main lifts of a training session, and that would be jumping with a hex bar, lifting a moderate load with a hex bar, or lifting a hex bar, squat variation, bench, the big bang for your buck, the big return on investment exercises. Upper body push and pull in a horizontal plane, predominantly hex bar, dead squat. I don't know, Stephen, if you do anything any more novel than that. I know from my little VBT road trip in May over Europe, I know a lot of the football soccer guys want to look at the single leg variations like the Bulgarian split squat. So I'm going to definitely look at some of the VBT with some single leg variations going forward, but predominantly and historically, Matt, I hope I can call you Matt, the big bang for your buck, big one, squat, deadlift, bench pull.
Yeah, I think
don't worry about velocity on your bicep curls.
Yeah, I think just to add to that as well, it's if we go back to some of those key monitoring strategies and the simple way in which we can, we might want to create a profile, or we might want to just check for, change over time, then I think it's important that exercise is consistent as well. So consistently in your program, if you're chopping and changing from exercise to exercise, from phase to phase, you lose that consistency and the consistency of data to make cross comparisons against athletes and against phases, and track adaptation. Now, obviously, there has to be variation in there because we don't want to sort of make training monotonous. But I think if we can have a staple in there that is consistent enough that we can make informed evaluations of progress, then I think that's really important, because unfortunately, as I'm sure everybody's aware in the call, if you've kind of done any kind of reading around VBT, is that every exercise or every profile is exercise specific. So we can't cross over from a squat to a deadlift or a bench to a pull or anything like that. It's got its own profile, which is frustrating, because it'd be lovely to be able to do one profile and that just be transferred all the way across every exercise. But unfortunately, that's not the case. So it's just from a sanity perspective, you pick your bang for your buck exercises and you utilize them, and the rest is back to traditional methods, I would say.
Yeah.
Just a quick one there just a quick one there, Brian here. Just on Matt's question there, and actually, was it Mitch from Game Changer? So is Mitch, is that your name? Yeah, I think an important point and what we've seen a little bit is around that educating athletes on what intent really is. And, you know, you're talking about applications, but certainly a lot of the med ball stuff, the slam swings and throws is getting people to throw with intent and understanding what that intent is like and being consistent in that intent. And while it's not kind of proven in terms of velocity loss, it's using velocity as that training. Using the same thing.
Yeah, very good point.
Yeah, I don't want to diverge, but yeah, the part of intent is that a lot of people do it as a circuit. So they might train, like especially boxing coaches, they'll do med ball slams. And so therefore they're not maximizing what they're getting for it because it's like go fast and get tired, rather than saying, look, this is like a strength training. You need to break it down, get your 1 second, put maximum effort into it. I mean, culturally, that is, especially in boxing, that is hard to do because they tend to do like quick circuits and then you're done.
Yeah, I think great point, Carl. And I know I've got some really good friends who work in boxing, and they've worked really hard to try and change that that understanding and the kind of the science behind training within boxing. But yeah, it's still I think a frustration around the ways in which some of the sessions are put together and how that intent can be lost through that type of training. So I think it's a good point.
Steve, on that, Trent's just asked a question which might be relevant for you to take. Is there any benefit in looking at landmine punch press to gain buy-in for combat sports?
Yeah, I think, so good question, because it does somewhat conflict with what Chris and I have just said around pick your key exercises and the staple ones, you bang for your buck. But I think there are some examples where actually that being specific to the sport is really, really important.
There was a recent paper that did come out. I think there was a recent paper that did come out. I can't remember where it is, but recently, the last maybe week or 2 weeks, reinforcing that is one of the most, because of the kinetic chain and movement, it is a key exercise to predict punch force.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, going back to boxing science, who kind of originated from my university at Hallam, that's their probably their staple profiling exercise is the landmine punch throw, because they've gathered so much data on it now, and like you said, Carl, it directly links to the way in which the kinetic chain works and force transmission within that punch and that strike. So I think it's definitely a good option for combat sports.
One that we've used before in combat sport is an incline bench Smith machine throw. And that's one that's kind of received quite well. So you're at that 10%. It's that kind of movement plane that they're happy with. And again, it's just that drive and intent. They'll be somewhere, they'll be hitting 1.4, but then all of a sudden it'll drop back down. So it causes them to drive that intent again. So that one where there's less variables in terms of movement of the bar, you're locked in place with the Smith machine. It works quite well. You just got to be careful on how heavy you load up and being able to catch it as well, which comes into play.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah,
I've not seen that being used, but it sounds interesting.
No, I mean, this is the great thing about these kind of forums as well. When you have a workshop, which isn't a webinar, it's kind of people having interactive conversations. And I think some of the conversations I've had in the last 6 months, particularly, a bit like the reference of Bulgarian split squat. The practitioners out there can take ownership and apply principles that have come from other areas of the field and take things forward. So there's no right or wrong for implementation. Yes, we can rely on our frame of reference and what we've exposed ourselves to and what we've learned from other practitioners. But also there's people in this forum here who've got combat experience doing different things. I absolutely kind of endorse doing things differently to get the outcomes that you want in your specific environments. And striking sports is something I've never had any exposure to at all. So for me, even as someone who would be deemed a relative, I guess, expert in VBT, who am I to say that the landmine punch is not the right application in a boxing or a combat sport domain when I've had no experience of that? But hopefully the cornerstone of VBT and the principles of VBT allow us all as practitioners to get better in our environments. And that's what this is about. It's not about me and Steve just talking at a group of people. It's those group of people also adding value, which they are doing, with their thoughts and sort of feedback on what they're doing in their training environments too.
But we're still trying to make athletes, general athletes to specific athletes, adaptable athletes. And so regardless, you still have foundations in terms of what people need. They need foundations. We all need a foundation, and then to build from that, just be specific. So, yeah.
Yeah, and you can get so much out of a landmine punch throw and a lower body exercise in one training session that's going to have a level of synergy and not a level of conflicting kind of, training adaptation. So it's all good from my point of view. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Happy days.
Good.
Go on, Chris, what are we moving on to?
No, I mean, I don't know if anyone from the floor's got any more questions. I mean, Stephen and I can talk VBT till blooming darkness, and bearing in mind it's going to get dark for Joe in about 7 hours' time. We can be here a while. But no, I mean, hopefully within the last sort of hour or so, we've given a sort of academic and an applied flavor to some of the main concepts and sub-themes around the application and the use of velocity-based training. I mean, for me, the more people who integrate VBT in their professional practice, the better. I mean, I've been very lucky that I stumbled upon it many, many years ago. And I think some of the key points that Steve brought up around fatigue management, load prescription, and the volume and intensity piece is just absolute gold when it comes to, not getting hung up on a specific set and rep protocol, but having that bandwidth and that continuum of adaptability within your training sessions. Would that be a fair take home for those who've listened in? You think about not having a rigid framework of training and have a more fluid framework to go off?
Definitely. You need feedback. You need to adapt to situations which are, you can't be fixed. If someone's, doing 5 sets, why continue to make them do it? If they're fatiguing, you need to be able to pace things out. It's a way of just managing, but also you have to learn to correlate as well as you communicate with the individual. And I think so there's easy aspects, but there's also the other aspect of trying to correlate and understand an individual, so you can adapt and correlate their performance and their readiness to train as well.
Totally. Yeah, that's good coaching. That's being in the moment, in the place that you're at, so that you can adapt. Because I've never written a session that's gone fully to plan over a 6-week period. I've had to manage and modify my training on a week-to-week basis. And like Steve suggests, the individualization of training for me is implementing velocity loss and understanding that metric, particularly when it comes to fatigue management. That's my biggest take home. And I think Kelly, I don't know if you're on mute or not, but are the group who are online going to get these slides? Because I know we've only spent our time on this particular slide, but I guess it just gives us a real good overview of our kind of core applications for VBT.
Of course, we'll send out these slides to everyone here.
We can send them the full paper if you want, Kelly. I'm not precious. Well, it's out there anyway, so anyone can get it. But let's send them the paper as some bedtime reading. We'll
do that. Super.
I'll read it tonight to put me to sleep, mate.
I don't blame you.
I've read it already, boss.
Guys, I just had one quick question, if you don't mind, just jumping back to the start. It was very interesting around the feedback, and it was just based off another webinar that was on with Dan Baker, and just around giving feedback when you're training certain zones. And he had a really interesting points around giving feedback like mid rep and after kind of sets, and around strength training. How he found that, like, if somebody, again, it was probably Steve based on your cognitive load kind of thing, if somebody's in strength training, he would have found that he's applied kind of practice that you don't give that feedback mid rep. You wait until the set's over and then you discuss. You give feedback, but is that a later point? So just understanding your kind of, I suppose, Chris, as well, with your work with strength athletes, how giving feedback might be based on the type of loads they're lifting and the type of zone they're in.
I mean, look, I'll talk from what the research says. Who am I to argue with the legend that is Dan Baker? But personally, and from what I've read in the research, immediate feedback after every rep is the best option, no matter what the loading is or what phase or zone you're in. By giving that immediate feedback after every repetition, that's when output is increased across the full set, or even across across interventions. So there's research out there that shows even across a 4-week intervention, by providing immediate feedback, the velocity output across every single session of that intervention was higher compared to doing it after the set.
I don't know if that includes, I don't know if that takes into considerations like any adjustments, if you're talking about any adjustments in technique, etc., or how long you're talking. I suppose the quicker the cue, the quicker the feedback, the more the person get on with what they're doing.
Yeah, I think, you know, it has to be immediate, and if you're going to utilize feedback for driving intent, I think you need to make sure that technically they're sound to be able to drive with intent, and that's the main aim of what you're doing. If the feedback is for technical aspects, then perhaps we're not going as heavy, and perhaps we're not driving as fast, and we're using the velocities to try and manipulate technique. But yeah, from what the research suggests, I'd be doing it after every repetition, no matter what the load.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Brian. I mean, it's great, and like Steve says, we can have a scrap with the Aussie guy Dan online another time potentially. But no, I mean, I like both, in fairness, which is potentially rep by rep for some people, and post set. I guess it's about people, set by set sometimes, and rep by rep for others. Do you know what I mean? There's players who want, and I don't know who said it in the conversation point, there's people who like rep by rep so that they can show and drive that intent for reps per set. And there's others who want to basically complete their set and then have almost like a set review. And I guess it's horses for courses with humans who some don't want to be bothered when they're lifting something heavy, and some do. And that's, I guess, understanding the human in front of you.
Definitely, yeah. It's like some people like a countdown, some people like a count up. All right, so you need to know which one they are.
That's why we love coaching. It's got to manage the person in front of us.
Yeah.
Chris, do you have much opportunities where you found athletes hate having all those numbers fired at them, and it kind of like breaks down what's going on in the set for them? Does it just melt their head?
Yes, I have in the past, but historically, for the most part, going back all the way back to the beginning of this workshop, the feedback and the numbers engages athletes more than it doesn't. So I have had people who are resistant to the feedback because maybe, so I won't name the player, it's unfair. In a rugby context, I've had players who maybe not the strongest within the group. They don't want their numbers shouted out in a training session. The Alpha over there, who's the silverback ruler, he's happy as Larry to know he's moving the bar the fastest. The slowest person in the room may or may not care as much, and ultimately it's about some say I don't want to use the velocity and all that, and that's absolutely no issue. I've got some good stories that I can't share publicly around players who didn't really care much for the gym, and VBT or otherwise they weren't going to be bothered, but on the field they were absolutely superb. So it's understanding the human in front of you. Very skillful, incidentally, very high level player who hated the gym, hated it, didn't really care much for it, but had one really good exercise, push press. And that he would happily do the velocity-based training stuff on the thing he was good at. Everything else, get that thing away from me. So it's for the most part, it has been really, really positive. And for most people, it's a really positive addition to the training environment. For some, you've just got to tread a bit carefully, and that's again about player understanding. Good question, though.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. But no, it's good. We could talk and talk. I hope you have had a good hour with us. We've enjoyed it. I hope you guys and girls have as well.
Yeah. I think for me, it's just I think one thing I haven't been using is drop-off rate. So I think I'll be using that a little bit more. Definitely.
Brilliant. It does give you a really good understanding of where a player is on any given day. And if there's a very steep decline from the first rep to the last rep, you know there's an underlying mechanism of fatigue. Agree, Steve?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Perfect. Velocity loss is a gold metric. I really like it. I think it's where some of the real value in VBT lies.
Beautiful.
Brilliant.
Well, right. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you. That was great. Thanks very much.
Thank you, buddy. Enjoyed it.
Guys, Joe, let's reconnect.
Yeah, please. That'd be awesome. Thank you.
Brilliant. I'll get your email off Kelly.
Awesome.
Love it. Good to see you.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.